Or good afternoon. My name is Graham Walker. Let me welcome you to the opening session of this week's Newsmaker interview series hosted by Dr. Marvin Olasky. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Olasky with us. As you may know, he's been an advisor to presidents, a key architect of a number of important welfare reform policies that had shown good success some years back. More recently, of course, he has been the provost at the King's College in New York City, also for many years the editor-in-chief of World Magazine, and now holds the distinguished chair in journalism and public policy here at Patrick Henry College. It's a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Olasky. We also welcome our guests. Some are here in the audience, some are joining us after the next class, others are watching via the live webcast, and also, ultimately, we are joined in these events by the 400,000 plus readers of World Magazine who read the written versions of most of these interviews. So that's something to look forward to as well. Let me welcome then our special guest today, who is Jennifer Marshall, who's Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation in nearby Washington, D.C. She heads the think tank's Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society, as well as overseeing FamilyFacts.org, an online resource for up-to-date reports on social science research on the family and religion. In 2010, National Journal named her one of the 20 power players in Washington. Oh, it must be fun to be called a power player. One of the 20 power players in Washington for her work on school choice and education reforms. She authored a book called Now and Not Yet: Making Sense of Single Life in the 21st Century, which explored the cultural, practical, and spiritual issues marriage-minded young women must sort through these days in a society where the age of first marriage is later than it used to be. Marshall also collaborated with a team of Heritage colleagues to release a collection of essays entitled Indivisible, examining how moral values and civil society relate to limited government, a strong economy, and foreign policy. And her recent commentary for the Gospel Coalition argued that it's not enough to care for the poor, by submitting the proposition to her readers that effective compassion is more important, challenging those with a heart for social justice to make time to fully research and understand the problems and the underlying dynamics leading to poverty. Please give our friend Jennifer Marshall a warm welcome, and thanks for both of you for being here.
Thanks. Well, Jennifer, after that introduction, I need to ask you, when you get up in the morning, do you look at the mirror and say, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the most powerful of them all?
Hardly. I look at another mirror and it tells me what to think of myself a little more clearly than that.
Okay, let's talk about a real power player 50 years ago, Lyndon Johnson, because last week was actually the 50th anniversary of his declaration of the war on poverty and his pledge that due to the wonders of government, poverty would soon be abolished. How close have we come to fulfilling that pledge?
Well, sadly, we have really missed the mark entirely. Where the poverty rate today is nearly as high as it was at the time that LBJ made that speech 50 years ago. We've hardly reduced the poverty rate, and yet we've spent $20 trillion on this war, more than all other wars combined. And so we've got to be getting deeper and asking more questions about why this stubborn persistence of the poverty rate. What should Christians be doing about it? What should citizens be thinking? We're not seeing the kind of reduction that we should have. And we can credit President Johnson for having said it's not enough simply to treat the symptoms of poverty. We need to cure it. We need to, above all, prevent it. Amen to that. But sadly, the legacy of the programs that has come out of the war on poverty, the welfare state as we know it today, is 80 programs that provide means-tested aid to poor and low-income Americans. It's cash, food, housing, medical assistance. This range of 80 programs, we're spending nearly $1 trillion a year on them. And yet, we see this stubbornly high rate of poverty. So we've got to be getting deeper at the question. And the thing that I point to first is the material definition of poverty that LBJ brought to the question has not gotten to the heart of the matter. We've got to get to the root of the problem, and that is a relational kind of deprivation today in America.
Okay, so relational deprivation, as opposed to just thinking about material deprivation. Let me ask first a question, and then we'll go more into that. Is poverty, given that the rate is the same, Does poverty now look like it looked 50 years ago?
In many ways, no, because not even the federal government can spend $20 trillion and have it not make a dent. We have seen an increase in the living standards of the poor, the material living standards of the poor. And we can be thankful for the fact that the kind of absolute poverty that we see in some developing nations, the kind of poverty, deprivation that literally might make people fear for their lives, make them very vulnerable, extremely vulnerable. That has been all but eradicated here. When we do see it, it's the result of extreme dysfunction or abuses that are contrary to the law. So what we're dealing with is a kind of relative poverty. So we have seen living standards increase. But what we have seen decrease, and this gets back to the relational poverty I mentioned, is that we have seen the erosion of the family, and particularly the collapse of marriage. When President Johnson announced the war on poverty, the rate of unwed childbearing was about 6 or 8%. Today, that number is 42%. And for black children, it at the time was 25%. Today, it's over 72%. So with 3/4 of children in the black community being born outside of marriage, nearly half of all children in America being born outside of marriage, that's a statistic we need to be gravely concerned about. The reason is that there is a very extraordinary link between the collapse of marriage and dependence on welfare and the state of poverty. A child born outside of marriage is 5 times more likely to be poor than a child raised in an intact family. And that, we'll get to the story of welfare reform in a little bit, but it was that breakthrough, that understanding on both the right and the left politically that really precipitated a change in the way that Washington did business in at least one welfare program in the mid-90s, contrary to the model that had been set up in the 60s.
I've sometimes seen among libertarians the idea that, well, if social conservatives are talking about marriage and so forth, I mean, they're getting involved in personal affairs. It's none of their business. People should be free, and we should be very tolerant of all kinds of different living situations. It's not a public matter, it's a private matter. How do you react to that critique? Well,
the first thing is that anyone concerned with limited government needs to be concerned about the stability of the family. Marriage and the family centered on marriage is a buffer for holding back the state and protects the individual. So those concerned about individual rights, about limited government, about reducing government spending, fighting centralization of power in Washington, for all those reasons, we should be concerned about the stability of the family. Now, how do we do that? The methods we do that, we should have much more of a robust debate about it. One thing we have to see is that leaders of our country need to be standing up and calling attention to the relationship between marriage and family stability and child poverty. And we don't see enough of that in the conversation today, where elected officials can call attention to this. This is the use of the bully pulpit, as it has been known, when an elected official isn't proposing legislation or some specific policy mechanism, but simply talking about and identifying the correct diagnosis of a problem and solution of a problem. President Obama is in a terrific place to be doing this. He has a beautiful family and by all counts has been a great father to his 2 daughters. If he could be calling attention to the need for fathers to be committed to the mothers of their children in marriage and to be devoted to the lives of their children by being present in a married family, that would be an enormous benefit to us. And yet we've heard 1 or 2 statements on Father's Day, but not a real sustained focus on the importance of marriage as a contributor to the common good, even though we hear so much about poverty and social welfare from this administration.
Okay, so one of the reasons that the poverty rate really hasn't moved is family non-formation, malformation, and so forth. You've also written a lot over the years on education. In fact, a decade ago, you were actually writing some articles in World on education.
That's right.
So what about that? What influence, how have things changed over the past 50 years there? What kind of, when you look at the educational attainment of people who go into poverty? What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, education alongside family is a very critical factor for social mobility, upward mobility in life. And one of those things we've seen in just the same period, in the same 50 years, from 1965, when the big federal intervention into local education came with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Today, that's known as No Child Left Behind. And all these reauthorizations of that law, one after the other, have led to further and further intervention from Washington. So the big story of the last 50 years in public education has been the centralization of policymaking. And right now we're debating whether there will be a common core, a standardized national set of standards and curriculum and standards and tests to go alongside them. And if that is, so what we're seeing is less of an opportunity for a community to design education according to the needs of the children there, and more centralization where bureaucrats in Washington do not know the names of children in need and how to design education fitting to them. We're going to see variance over across the states as to what children need in education. And the critical new idea on the block, if you will, in the last 25 years in particular, has been parental choice in education. And we've seen a tremendous growth in this. I think homeschooling is up to about 3% of students now. We have probably about 225,000 students participating in private school choice programs across the country. Lots of innovation in terms of the opportunity, the mechanisms that provide for choice, whether it be a voucher, a tax credit, education savings account. That's encouraging to see, because what this is doing is making our education conversation child-centered, not system-centered. And that has been part of why we can't really point to our public education system as being a tremendous help in this poverty fight over the last half century. In many cases, the zip code assignment system we use for education policy today, that you're locked in, you go to the school that your zip code says you go to, with very few exceptions. And thankfully, we're seeing more now with the growth of school choice. But that has really locked children into failing public schools in many cases. And so the idea that public education was meant to help everyone rise towards upward mobility has been a promise not delivered on through public education these last decades.
Have researchers been able to correlate some of these things? For example, 42% or so of children today are born into single-parent situations. What about when folks go to when there's school choice, when folks go to Christian schools, private schools, or even magnet schools of different sort, and what kind of percentage then, and then they start having children. Do we know what percentage of those children are born in single-parent situations as opposed to married couple situations?
I can't tell you that aspect of the equation, but what is interesting, and this is the result of the work of Pat Fagan, my former colleague at Heritage, now at the Family Research Council, he has looked at the variables of marriage and religious practice, and particularly the combination of those two. But he's also looked at when unwed mothers, when single moms are involved in a church and getting their children involved in that community, that religious connection, that religious practice, when it's not just a stated belief but a practiced religious commitment, really makes an anomaly in that case. They deviate from the norms that we have expected to see in single mother families. Other research has pointed to religious education as helping to make up some of that, what we call the achievement gap, between either disadvantaged economically or minority children and their peers. So helping to religious commitment to a church, religious education does seem to help begin to bridge that achievement gap.
Okay, so there's in public policy terms, if you're looking for things that help, one thing that helps is church involvement, right? Another thing that helps is being able to go to a better school and so forth. If we found other things besides religious involvement as magic bullets to really reduce the problem, then people would be jumping all over that and saying, gee, we have to have more of it. That doesn't seem to be the case here, at least in terms of most people in Washington, right?
No, it doesn't. And one reason I think is that it's much easier to say, well, let's just start a new program and let's spend some more on it. So the complexities of these have been elusive to many Washington policymakers. I would also say we need more conservatives addressing poverty as poverty. We've had what I've called staccato note approach, where we have welfare reform 1996, we have school choice over here, but we haven't had a lot in between that starts a melody about fighting poverty that people could catch on to. So man on the street in America is, when you ask them about poverty solutions, I think the default is going to sound much more like the liberal, spend more money in Washington, start a new program, rather than the more complex approach that gets at human dignity, the relational breakdown, and the need to restore marriage, family, community, and help people get access to those things in life, like education, that provide upward mobility.
So what are the best things? You're at the Heritage Foundation and from that vantage point, and you're seeing relational poverty. What are your three major proposals? Let's talk, Washington speak. Your elevator pitch on what should be done. How would you summarize that?
Well, the most important thing is not even a policy proposal. It's tapping those institutions in society that have relational capital to spend it. And by that, I particularly mean families who are able to give to other families in terms of their relational mentoring. Church is an enormous possessor of this relational capital I'm talking about. The church knows something, Christians know something about relationship restoration. And that's something that should be shared and spread in very practical terms so that there might be marriage mentoring that happens between older couples and going into neighborhoods where perhaps a young person has never been to a wedding. That happens. I actually heard a store vendor say she'd never been to a wedding just last weekend. I think we're going to see that happening more and more as the marriage rate declines. So helping people form a vision for marriage and gain the relational skills. So look to the relational institutions. The second would be that under the welfare reform of 1996, and we probably need in a minute to come back and define what that was all about, the temporary assistance to needy families program that came out of that allows governors to use the funding under that program to experiment with helping couples at risk or disadvantaged single mothers to find resources to help them so that they would even know about the facts about marriage, reducing the probability of their child's poverty and their dependence on welfare. So governors can take the lead in this. And then finally, I think we need elected officials to use their capacities of leadership, their bully pulpit, to point to this connection between marriage and poverty. If a child, think about all the times today that we say to a junior high or high school student, don't drop out of school, don't smoke, fasten your seatbelt. They hear that hundreds of times by the time they've graduated from high school. In this case, we have hardly any messages today that are saying, did you know marriage reduces the probability of child poverty by 80%? Did you know? Just did you know statements. So if we could have public officials making that common knowledge, I think we would see that kind of public conversation reaps results, and we need to have it.
Of course, stay in school, there are those messages all the time, but yet in urban areas, at least 50% of kids drop out of school, don't graduate from high school, at least within 4 years. I mean, some of them later do it or get GEDs. So it doesn't seem like all those messages have been all that effective.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we could point to campaigns that are more or less. It would be interesting to see what the dropout rate would be without that kind of thing. But we certainly have it, say, for smoking. That has, I think, become taboo. I would think that has been one that's the campaign on that has gotten its desired result.
Or people now coughing into their arms rather than their
right,
hands.
Exactly.
That's been effective.
The Sibelius cough, yes.
So, but how do you? What would work here?
Well, I think talking about it, and the actual relational life-on-life kind of communication of this. Relational skills are not always caught, particularly when you're growing up in environments where they aren't modeled.
Okay.
So there have to be some interventions, and I mean by that of the kind that are relationally, personally driven. I'm not talking about, in these cases, necessarily a government intervention. It's got to be a very personal intervention.
Okay, so let's go, because you've referred a couple of times to the 1995-96 welfare reform. What worked in that? What didn't work? What have we learned from that whole experience?
So the important part of the welfare reform of '96 was that it looked at the major cash assistance program called Aid to Families with Dependent Children and said, hey, we are handing out lots and lots of money here, and yet we're not getting the desired result, particularly the result that President Johnson had sought to prevent poverty. Said we are seeing cyclical poverty, intergenerational dependence, and researchers at that time, you were a part of this conversation, of course, identified two major factors. The system was telling single moms in particular, you can keep getting your welfare check so long as you don't have a job, and so long as you don't marry somebody with a job who kicks your income up. And those two disincentives were getting what you would expect. They were driving people not to work, and that was eventually running afoul of the American sensibility that, hey, we want to be helpful here. We also want to make sure that everybody's doing what they can to help themselves. So you often hear the idea of a hand up, not a handout. That's what welfare reform tried to do, was to say, look, let's make sure that those in true need, who don't have any other place to turn, are getting the help that they need for the time they need it. But let's immediately start them on the path towards work, towards personal responsibility. And the thing that does, to put a work requirement on the program, is it has a dissuasion effect in the language of social science right up front. Because some people will say, well, if I have to bother coming into the welfare office every week to say I'm looking for a job, I might as well just go get the job that I know I can get anyway. So it steers away those who do have other means to subsist, while offering the safety net for those who really don't have that. The dramatic results of that work requirement was that the welfare rolls fell by half in the 5-year period after. The poverty rates among single mothers and among the most affected children fell to their lowest levels in history. So really dramatic results. So much so, you'll probably remember this anecdote, when Rick Warren was having the presidential candidate debate out at Saddleback Church, and he asked then Senator Obama, candidate for president, what had he changed his mind on. Senator Obama acknowledged welfare reform. He had at first been in the chorus of naysayers who said this is going to leave more children on the streets, we're going to see starvation by the hundreds of thousands. Huge hysterical criticism from the left at the time, when it was just the contrary. Remarkable progress in uplifting those in need. And Senator Obama admitted as much, and that was to his credit. Sadly, during his administration, he has not been so supportive of the policy and even done some things to erode the work requirement policy. But I think there has been broad agreement that this formula for reforming welfare is in the interest of the people receiving it and is in the interest of the taxpayer and our culture generally.
Okay, so that worked over that 5-year period. I mean, do we know what's happened in the almost 15 years since then?
Yes. So there has been the very promising thing that we saw was that even during this recession cycle, the poverty rate did not spike as much as we had seen it do in the past. Now, the dramatic effects that we saw up front on welfare reform have been more muted in the past years. One of the reasons for that is that the pressure has not been kept up on governors to continually keeping those the welfare rolls down in their states by helping people get out into work. Policies like the Obama administration's HHS memo that said that they were willing to waive the work requirement, something that is not legal for them to do and something that would rip the heart out of welfare reform, that has communicated to states that this is not a priority any longer. So that has sent the wrong message. And perhaps the most disappointing thing has been that, as I mentioned before, TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, allows for governors to experiment with how to help those single mothers, single parent families, how to communicate a message of marriage to prevent poverty in the future. And we haven't seen much experimentation with that at all.
Okay. Now, as AFTC became TANF, Temporary Age Needy Families, and we did see the number there declining, but at the same time, we've seen an increase in the number of people on SSDI and SSI, which involve disability. And so apparently some of the people who were formerly on that are now becoming, classifying themselves, being classified by others as disabled and able to get that program.
Yes.
And then we've also seen the enormous growth in food stamps. I mean, just in the past 5 years, from 26 million to 47 million, something like
Massive.
that. It's been huge. So even though that one program hasn't grown to the extent it had before, we have all these other programs, and so, when you look back at it, we saw that working, but overall, I would like to say, gee, this was a great victory with this welfare reform in 95, 96, but overall, when you look back at it, what do you think?
Well, actually, the facts you just laid out are exactly right, but it's also why we should be optimistic in that the template of 96 TANF reform worked. The trouble was we only applied it to one program, and we need to go systematically through as many of the other 80 programs as it applies to make sure that we are converting these, as we did TANF, to a work activation program. So food stamps needs to be a work activation program, having the same kind of work requirement that TANF does. These other programs, we need to change the incentive structures so that the levers are not pointing towards dependence, but they're pointing towards self-sufficiency. So the call is, the lesson of 96 welfare reform is we need to do this across the welfare state, and we need to get control of this massively growing 80 program behemoth, and that's what legislation introduced by Congressman Jordan has done, and a senator is now considering introducing that as well. So that's the conversation going forward about why we need to replicate this and other things.
Okay. Now compassionate conservatism, as we discussed it in the late 90s and so forth, was supposed to be decentralizing, was supposed to be limited government, was supposed to be small government rather than large government, and bringing in churches and other groups that are much more able to develop relational capital and social capital. It became known, sadly, during the Bush administration as somewhat of a big government program, unfortunately, because it got involved in the whole thing of, well, we still want to be free to give money out to those whom we think are deserving, rather than decentralizing. What should we call this new endeavor now? You're talking about relational capital. I know back in 95, 96, we had a thing called the Center for Effective Compassion, and I see effective compassion is still there. You had and I recommend this to everyone. The Heritage Foundation put out a online program that's still available called Seek Social Justice. Do we call this social justice? Do we call this effective compassion? We need something to tag this. Do you have a recommendation?
Well, I think effective compassion works nicely for the holistic framework that we've got to have if we're going to tackle this issue. And by effective compassion, what I mean is a right diagnosis of the problem. Much of the poverty we see in America is relational at its root rather than material. Material is byproduct of the relational breakdown. And also taking into account the kinds of responses that are needed. And the kinds of responses are needed from different players. And those different players are family, church, business, government. Each of those has a responsibility and a way to help in this question about poverty and social breakdown. And yet, so much of the conversation we hear on the nightly news presumes that most of the answer is government. Yeah. So if we have a right framework that looks at the roles and responsibilities of all those, we're going to get it, I think, closer to right. And then for the role of government within that, government is limited, and it might be able to provide temporary material needs assistance, but then it needs to be able to point people towards those other institutions of society that have more relational capital. And so one way I think that conservatives need to be better acquainted with the mechanisms of government in order to change the incentive structures within them. And by that I mean, it was interesting during the faith-based initiative that was housed in the White House. Eventually it spread out to other agencies. But I think that kind of got it backwards. What you need to have effective compassion implemented in government is to have assistant secretaries and deputy assistant secretaries who have program responsibility, thinking like Alexis de Tocqueville. Mm-hmm. And so they're thinking about, government's not really good at these things, so how are there ways that I can help point the people that are right now dependent on these programs to those resources outside of government? It's not an exchange of money. It's a pointing towards the resources that are already available. Not that this is a federal example, but an example would be a parole officer having a big Rolodex of lots of contacts that he could use to refer those parolees towards churches to help them get networked in the community, to help find a job, that kind of thing.
Okay. We'll turn to your question in just a moment, but I wanted to raise one other subject here, because not only are you an expert on poverty and many other areas, but Now and Not Yet, your book from 2007?
Yep.
It's a really interesting book, and maybe you could just let people know about that a little bit, and then be time for you to ask questions either about poverty or about what Jennifer's going to relate to you right now.
Sure.
Tell us about that.
So I wrote in 2007 a book called Now and Not Yet, Making Sense of Single Life in the 21st Century. And I really wanted to tackle this issue of singleness lasting longer than we expect these days than in our mother's generation. I heard a lot of young women wrestling with this, wondering why, asking a lot of why questions. And the most important, some of that is, macro cultural patterns that are interesting to me in a public policy sense. But a lot of it was also very, very personal. And how do you deal with the postponement of the desires of your heart? How do you live on a daily basis with contentment here and now while hoping for something more? And that led to, as the book is titled, Now and Not Yet, and trying to talk through, for an audience of single women, the idea of having a heart poised between what God has for us now and what we hope for in the future. So I investigated a few of the causes, I thought, culturally, for delayed marriage. The feminist movement and the casual sex culture resulting from the sexual revolution have certainly contributed to making more difficult the entry to marriage. It's been a fraught subject throughout human history, but it's gotten even more complex, I think, since these recent cultural developments in the late 20th century. So I kind of diagnose that and then talk through, if we want to be content here and now, we need to have a sense of what our first call is, and through that, what God has for us in terms of our daily callings and how to pursue Him. Marriage may one day be a part of that, but we are still serving God and our first call to Him, even if that does not become a part of our lives. And here's the book was a part of the conversation as to what that looks like.
Good. Questions for anyone here? Over here.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today. I'm very passionate on the issue of protecting marriage against the erosion that's happening in our society. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on what young people can be doing now to get involved in stopping that erosion.
Yeah, and are you concerned both with the kinds of sociological patterns I was talking about, as well as the redefinition of marriage?
Yes, ma'am.
Both. Okay.
Yeah,
right.
we have to protect the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's an enormous thing, and it's very important that young people like yourself do stand up and find ways to speak out about it. This is, all the messages in the culture are trying to say it's inevitable, marriage is going to be redefined. We don't think that. We have spent the last year really focused on articulating a clear message about what marriage is, why it matters for public policy, and what the consequences are of redefining it. And we published a small booklet called What You Need to Know About Marriage with the Family Research Council, Focus on the Family, the National Organization for Marriage, and Alliance Defending Freedom. And you can get that online at heritage.org/marriage. That tool, I think, is very helpful for just having Thanksgiving dinner type conversations, or when you're together with friends or peers, being able to lead them through the why marriage matters as a public institution, not just a private contract between two people, but this has significance for us and it should matter to all citizens. So that book that was out there, the other reason we're encouraged is because my colleague Ryan Anderson, who wrote the book with Robbie George, What is Marriage, has lectured all across the country now. And he goes to college campuses and will present this case for marriage. And afterwards, without fail, there are several students who come up to him and say, I have never heard this case for marriage. Now, that doesn't immediately convert them on the spot necessarily, but it is the first time they've had the benefit of being able to think through a cogent case for this most basic social institution. That means we need more people carrying this message, and I hope all of you will be a part of that in the ongoing generation. It's not that people have heard and rejected the message, it's that most people haven't heard why this is so significant. So you can help us in spreading that word. I think that's particularly important.
Let me ask another question here. I was looking at a study, and I know you're aware of this, that given the greater incidence of crime and unmarried pregnancy and school dropouts among folks who are in single-parent situations as opposed to having both a father and a mother at home, that if our family structure now were similar to the family structure 50 years ago, there would be half a million fewer adolescents committing violent crimes and often going to prison. There would be 1 million fewer students suspended from school and thus being able to, if they weren't continuing their education and being able to get employment. There'd be 70,000 fewer attempting suicide. In other words, these are the greater incidents for people with our current family structure compared to what it was 50 years ago. So these are. I mean, I hear and I certainly value, since $20 trillion does seem like a lot of money, spare change for some perhaps, but still. So there's that. There's the money aspect, which is significant, but in some ways, what I think moves the needle more in terms of people thinking about these problems is the personal aspects.
That's right.
So how do you get to that as a public policy think tank heritage? How do you get to these relational questions and then the real human tragedies that come out of this change in family structure?
Right. The money pales in comparison to the toll of the human tragedy, for sure. And so I think part of that is to remember in the tone that any of us use for debating these issues that we are talking about human beings. And I'll say that for any of these issues that have come up here: poverty, marriage, family. We are talking about some of the most intimate aspects of a human being's life. And so when we talk, we must remember that and personalize it as much as possible. One of the most effective sets of spokespersons for this whole idea have been the folks that Bob Woodson pulls together. Bob Woodson is our friend at the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, and back in the 90s, he was pulling together town halls of people who had been on welfare, been, kind of the victims that we've been talking about here, people who've gone through the life experiences. And it was their recommendation. They wanted shorter time limits on welfare. They knew that the welfare system needed to be reformed because they saw firsthand and experienced the degradation of it, the way that it eroded the stability of their communities. So lifting up voices who can tell firsthand experiences, I think, is a really critical way to go forward. And World Magazine, I know, has been devoted to this over the years, is that kind of first-person testimonial. So I think, seeing through other eyes is critically important for policymakers. One of the things that we've done with members of Congress is to take them out into neighborhoods to see the projects that Bob Woodson works with. So they're not talking in dry abstractions about a budget sheet, but they're talking, their conversations and outlook are informed by having met Bishop Shirley in Southeast DC, who runs a drug addiction and homelessness center there, or Freddie Garcia's now legacy operation in Texas for drug addiction there with Jubal, his son carrying it on. So these, I think, giving policymakers firsthand knowledge is a powerful way to make it personal.
Now, if there are folks watching or people eventually reading in World and they want to think about what their churches can do, what's a good example of what a church can do? I know you've written about, and I've written about First Baptist in Leesburg.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about that, or just what practical things can a church person who cares about this be suggesting that his church get involved in?
Great. Well, I love this question. So let me first name a couple of resources just so I don't leave those out. Number one, our SeekSocialJustice.com curriculum. SeekSocialJustice.com is a 6-week study guide with DVD and workbook for anybody who wants to investigate this framework of relational poverty and the institutions of society that can combat it. Second resource, really great book, is called When Helping Hurts, co-authored by Brian Fickert down at Covenant College. And it looks at some of these same questions. Each of those is a great tool to go through with your church. The First Baptist Church in Leesburg is a fabulous profile here, and we do profile them and Seek Social Justice. Pastor Roselle there tells the story of when his church was venturing into helping the needy, and they would do the typical things like a soup kitchen or a shelter. And what they were finding was that they were seeing a lot of cycling through, and so the same people would be coming in for a meal, the same people would be coming in for a bed. And he realized we're not doing the job that we're called to do, restoring people. So they started thinking much more relationally. And this is, I think, the first thing that a church needs to do is to think relationally about these issues. Not just material diagnosis, but knowing a person well enough to know the holistic package of that person's needs. And that means ministries that give time to develop such relationships and that capitalize on what the church has to give. And what the church has to give is love, relational restoration, all these things that other players in society don't necessarily have, because the church knows something of the love of Christ and the restoring capacity of that love. We're called to pass that on. So First Baptist then transferred to doing a ministry of helping addicts overcome their dependence. It was a residential program and very rigorous in terms of the progress that they expected people to make. They saw a lot of dropouts, and one of the testimonials that we have in the video is the man saying how sad it was for him to see people walk away and slip through their fingers. But it also was the only thing that gave credit to the dignity of these individuals who were prisoners of their addictions, to help them get out of those chains and seek the spiritual transformation. And that is the most key ingredient of all this, that the First Baptist approach recognizes the spiritual transformation that needs to take place, particularly in these deep-seated problems like addiction or relational breakdown that happen.
Questions? Question down over there.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. It's been wonderful. I have a question about going back to the statistics you mentioned earlier about the unmarried women that increases the poverty rate. And I just, excuse me, I just got in a debate recently about that, and there was questions about if that's truly the cause, because obviously the erosion of marriage and poverty are linked, but how do we untangle the complex the cause between the two?
Right. So always establishing causality in social science is a very, very high bar. This is an extremely strong correlation that has been seen time and time again. And so we wouldn't want to say that the welfare state was responsible for the entire erosion of marriage that we've seen. There are certainly other cultural forces going on. We are seeing the things I mentioned, the sexual revolution and so on, variety of dynamics that have changed childbearing, have changed family stability, that have changed marriage. So the welfare state has been built up alongside those cultural dynamics in a way that's exacerbated the problem. And study after study has demonstrated the perverse incentives that the welfare state programs had. And I think particularly back in the 90s, you saw a lot of publishing right and left in the political spectrum about the relationship between marriage and child poverty.
Other questions? I ask another one. What do conservatives often do wrong in talking about poverty?
So I think number one, we talk about it in the abstract when we need to remember that this is first and foremost a tragedy in terms of the human toll that's taken and the lack of flourishing. So we need to talk in terms of human flourishing. The reason that we think limited government is good, not as an end in itself, but because it leads to the kind of thriving individuals, families, and communities that every person seeks and that we would all like to enjoy. The second thing is how to establish our principles in this area of welfare. And one in particular is, most often conservatives are wanting to get the solution as close to the problem as possible. And that's a right instinct. But how to do that in the realm of welfare has proved a little elusive. So one of the critical things is, as we seek to, it's important to know that most federal welfare programs, those 80 programs that I mentioned, are almost entirely funded at the federal level. So this is taxes raised at the federal level, program structure created at the federal level. And so if we want to drive more decision-making back to the states in this, we also need to push more funding responsibility to the states. So instead of food stamps being a 95% federally funded program right now, we should see a ratchet that would eventually move 80-20, 70-30, 50-50 state and federal expenditures on that program. And eventually, the federal government shouldn't need to be involved in that. That's a process that needs to happen over time. One of the reasons that TANF was the first program to be reformed was that it was a kind of shared responsibility. It didn't have that enormously lopsided federal funding responsibility. And so states had some skin in the game. States were concerned about bloated welfare rolls because it ate out of their budget as well. So they had a stake in it, and the reforms that required work or people to be looking for work helped them as well, and it helped their situations at the state level. So that shared responsibility should result, it should be, what shared responsibility, what federalism would look like in welfare is states taking more of the revenue responsibility for it, not just a block grant kind of system that would hand the money over, because that lacks the accountability, where a governor would not have the accountability towards, he doesn't raise the taxes, he's not accountable to the people for that. And yet the no strings attached policy would not necessarily encourage doing the right thing. You want to have the right incentive structures for bureaucrats, for policymakers, and for the program recipients. And
this goes to your point about the ineffectiveness of just reforming one program when there are 79 others, because insofar as TANF, temporary aid to needy families, was a joint federal-state responsibility, it became easier, convenient, and desirable on the state level to shift people from TANF into the Social Security disability insurance, which was entirely borne by the feds.
That's right.
So it's
a very good illustration of it. Yeah.
So, other questions or thoughts, either on poverty or singleness? One thing I'd like to ask, anyone here have any experience within a church, let's say, or some other structure in trying to help poor individuals and poor families? Any experience, positive or negative, from which you've learned?
high school, I volunteered for 4 years actually at a crisis pregnancy center, and they had really good educational structured programs where the girls were in job training or in community college classes, and they had one-on-one mentorship programs, and they did have material assistance, but the relational and educational training that they offered really made it more valuable than just giving them diapers and formula. So.
Good. Yeah, that's important. No one should walk away from here with the impression that material assistance isn't a part of the equation for those in dire need, but we shouldn't stop there. And particularly as Christians, we shouldn't stop there, because we know the holistic range of needs that a person has. Brian Fickert names them as relationship with God, self, others, and the rest of creation. And thriving means healthy, proper relationships in all those dimensions. So helping people think that through and help it in an applied sense, not just as an abstraction, but looking at in the real situation of an unplanned pregnancy is the perfect example of that kind of relational outreach. Thank you.
Let me ask address two other questions toward our audience here. Number one, and here's a public policy fix, and again, some of this may be Band-Aids on cancer, but nevertheless, if those of you who are taxpayers, if instead of sending, let's say, $500 of your taxes into Washington, if you could take that right off your taxes by sending a $500 check to a community anti-poverty group of your choice, whether religious or non-religious, how many of you would still want to send that $500 to Washington for Health and Human Services, let's say, to dispense, as opposed to sending it to some group in your own community? Any hands? Amazingly enough, I see none. How many of you would want to send it to state government? Send it to, in Virginia here, send it to Richmond and have those folks dispense it with their tender, loving care? How many of you would go to City Hall and say, okay, here's the $500, you spend it? I don't see. How many of you know of some church group, non-church group, something that's non-governmental that you think would spend that $500 better than any of these government agencies? So here I see hands going up. So that's a practical question. Well, why do we want to keep sending money to Washington when just about everyone knows? I've occasionally, as I was going around speaking about this over the years, I've occasionally asked that question to audiences, and maybe only 3 out of thousands of people have put up their hands saying I'd send it to Washington, and all 3 of them were professors. So anyway. Okay, that's question 1. Susan, you have a question? I'll ask my second question. Okay, Susan knows my second question. How many of you during the past year have had some one-to-one contact with a person who was poor and you were trying to help that person? I see a few hands going up. I mean, it strikes me that the enormity of the problem sometimes leaves us feeling helpless, being passive, and so forth. And so I tend to go back to Psalm 131, which talks about things too wonderful for me. If we think of the big problems, the problems of evil in the world, war, poverty, and so forth, it just seems enormous. And then the psalmist goes on to say, but I have still quieted my soul. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. And so it's this emphasis on what an individual can do. If you think of the big picture, the tendency is to become passive and feeling helpless. But if you think of what you can do to help one particular individual, and what I'd recommend to all of you, and I've seen this work all over the country, is the easiest way to get into this is through a tutoring program of some sort. With a 4th grader who can't read, and his whole life you're starting to see the slope of rolling down the hill and rolling into poverty. And individuals are often very successful by caring about that child, by spending an hour a week with that child, and consistently doing that are often very helpful in turning that child back to a path then of more education, paying more attention in school, seeing that I can succeed, and that has enormous
Right.
implications down the road.
And I'll just add to that that I think stewardship does demand that of us. As Christians, we are called to steward what we've been given, and we have occasions to help those in need in the ways that Marvin has described. We also must steward our citizenship. And so we can't wash our hands of the policy question because our voices are necessary in defining that policy response. So for as long as there is a federal role and presence in these poverty programs, I think the most important detail to focus on in this myriad and blizzard of details that I admit can be hard to see through, focus on the incentive structure and follow the people who are focusing on the incentive structure. Work, marriage, the personal responsibility aspects. The reform models that are focusing on those aspects are the ones that have produced results versus the ones that have a material diagnosis and simply throw more money at the program, start at the problem, start another program, and hide behind that to say we've done our duty to the poor. So stewardship, I think, has both those things, a personal commitment and also that stewardship of our citizenship role to care about the direction of policy in our land.
Okay, then you mentioned earlier Jim Jordan and what he's trying to do as a leader in the House of Representatives. Can you tell us briefly about what his proposals are and which of those do you think are most important?
Yeah, so Congressman Jordan has introduced a bill that was also introduced during the last Congress, and we expect it'll gain more steam this time. It's two parts, and these two parts kind of summarize what we've been talking about here today. The first part deals with the size and scope and magnitude of these 80 programs of the welfare state, and so it tries to cap the runaway growth. The second part deals with work activation and recognizing that incentives matter, as you've heard me say a dozen times here today. Work matters, and so it takes the food stamp program as an exhibit A, a template, and says let's transform that into a work activation program, institute a work policy like the TANF reform, and so that is a model of what should be done in additional programs, but let's at least start with food stamps, which has gotten so much conversation going. So the first part would simply say that spending on these welfare programs should not grow any faster than inflation. The reason why that extremely basic and minimal reform is necessary is that during each recession that our country has gone through, liberals have clamored for more and more assistance to those in need. Well, even granting for the sake of argument that that is a good response, after the recession ends, welfare spending has never come down. And so what this would do is to say when employment levels get to their historically normal level, you would then institute this cap so that welfare programs would not grow any faster than inflation. That would be the response to the spending, and then the work activation on food stamps. That gives, in addition to being very good policy, it helps teach all policymakers who are willing to pay attention what the basic premise of this whole conversation is about.
Let me ask one more question here about, let's deal with future potential Republican candidates for presidency. What should one of these individuals who's thinking about running for president, what should that individual be doing in 2014 to prepare himself to be able to relate to these issues, these problems, these individuals, rather than just dismissing them or in some other way showing he's not in touch? What kind of education would you like potential candidates to be getting during 2014 before the big-time campaigning begins in 2015?
Well, all policymakers need to be better educated about this question in two ways. They need to be better educated about the actual problem, the actual solution that we've been talking about here today. What is the diagnosis of poverty in America? And second, they need to understand the welfare state as it exists. And that is eating your broccoli. It is a confusing maze of policy to get through these 80 federal programs. But we need more policymakers taking more time to get acquainted with that so that they can debate how and be successful in accomplishing the change of the incentive structure I was talking about. Secondly, they need to be learning to talk about this in a way that communicates the melody of an anti-poverty approach that can that can catch on with the American people. And they can only do that if they have the credibility that comes by being known and knowing those who have experienced poverty, who have experienced social breakdown. So that means showing up, listening, learning to those whose experience we may not have shared, but we need to understand what it is like to go through poverty in America. So getting acquainted with the projects that are having success in helping people overcome obstacles, going to Victory Fellowship and to House of Hope and these places that are dramatically successful in their outreach. Those would be the kinds of things I would hope more policymakers would engage in.
Okay, and I do recommend Seek Social Justice, the Heritage Foundation's curriculum, because it does help us to think about both the big policy issues, but then also what we as individuals can do. Tomorrow, we'll be interviewing here Marvin Paget, who I've known for 25 years or so, and he has been editor-in-chief at various Christian publishing houses and knows that industry very well. And we're going to be talking about secrets of the Christian publishing industry, including the proliferation of ghostwriting, the way people try to get a snowball effect and get onto the bestseller list, things of that sort. So I think that'll be intriguing. Right now, please join me in thanking Jennifer for coming here today.